On September 28, 1781, a British army under Lord Charles Cornwallis woke up inside a town they had spent weeks turning into a fortress, and found that the world outside their trenches had quietly closed around them. Yorktown sat on a narrow finger of land jutting into the York River, and for months Cornwallis had believed that river was his lifeline. Ships could reach him, reinforcements could reach him. Escape, if it ever came to that, could reach him by water. What he did not yet understand, on that grey September morning, was that the sea itself had already been taken from him. How does a professional European army, veterans of a dozen campaigns, get walked into a trap by a coalition of farmers, tradesmen, and foreign volunteers, and never see it coming until it is far too late to matter? That is the question sitting at the centre of this story, and the answer has almost nothing to do with the moment the trap finally closed. It has everything to do with the 6 years before it. Cornwallis was not a fool. He was, by most accounts, one of the more capable field commanders Britain sent across the Atlantic. He had chased George Washington out of New Jersey in the brutal winter campaigns of 1776 and 1777, when the American cause looked one hard frost away from collapse. He had crushed an American army at Camden in 1780, a defeat so total that the Continental commander in the South, Horatio Gates, fled the battlefield on horseback and did not stop riding for days. Cornwallis had spent the better part of 2 years grinding through the Carolinas, winning battle after battle, bleeding his own army white in the process, and convincing himself that every tactical victory was pulling him closer to strategic triumph. It was the oldest trap in military history. He kept winning fights he could not afford, against an enemy that could afford to lose them. There is a version of Cornwallis that gets flattened in the popular memory of this war, reduced to the villain who loses at the end, and that version misses what made him dangerous for most of the conflict. He came from Old English aristocracy, trained at a military academy in Italy, and had actually opposed the tax policies that provoked the American colonies in the first place, arguing in the House of Lords against the very measures that would eventually send him across the ocean to fight the rebellion those measures caused. He requested the American command not out of ambition, but out of a soldier's sense of duty, and once in the field, he fought with a relentlessness that unsettled his opponents. Where other British commanders moved cautiously, wary of overextending supply lines in hostile territory, Cornwallis pushed. He marched his men harder, further, faster than the terrain or the season usually allowed, and for years it worked. It worked at Brandywine. It worked at Camden, where he shattered an American army twice his size and sent its commander fleeing so fast that Gates reportedly covered over 60 miles on horseback in a single stretch without stopping to rest. Cornwallis had built an entire reputation on the idea that speed and aggression could substitute for numbers, and by 1781, that reputation had convinced him and much of London that he was close to finishing what 6 years of war had failed to accomplish. What that reputation obscured was a simpler truth. Every campaign Cornwallis won in the Carolinas cost him men he could not replace. 3,000 miles from home, with no local population willing to refill his ranks, the way American militia could refill Continental losses almost overnight. He was winning a war of attrition against an enemy who could afford attrition, while he could not. By the time he turned north into Virginia in the spring of 1781, his army had been marching and fighting for the better part of 2 years without meaningful rest. And though he did not fully register it yet, he was no longer the hunter in this conflict. He had become, without realizing it, something closer to prey that still believed it was in control of the chase. By the spring of 1781, Cornwallis made a decision that would define the rest of the war. He marched his exhausted, depleted force out of the Carolinas and into Virginia, chasing the promise of Loyalist support and a defensible coastal position, where the Royal Navy could resupply and reinforce him at will. His superior in New York, General Henry Clinton, wanted him to fortify a deep-water harbor and wait. Cornwallis chose Yorktown, a modest tobacco port on the York River, and set his men to building earthworks, redoubts, and gun emplacements around the town. On paper, it looked sound, a fortified position, backed by the sea, supported by the most powerful navy on earth. In practice, it was a cage and Cornwallis had built the bars himself. Here is what he could not see from inside Yorktown. 6 years into the war, France had not just entered the conflict as America's ally. France had committed a professional army under the Comte de Rochambeau, and more importantly, a battle fleet under Admiral François de Grasse, one of the most experienced naval commanders in the French service. For most of the war, that fleet had operated in the Caribbean, protecting French sugar islands, always just out of reach when American commanders needed it most. In the summer of 1781, de Grasse made a choice that would end the war. He decided to bring his entire fleet north to the Chesapeake Bay at exactly the moment Cornwallis had wagered his entire army on that same body of water staying open. Subscribe now, because what happens over the next 3 weeks is one of the most complete strategic collapses any British commander suffered in the 18th century, and almost none of it happened the way you'd expect a siege to unfold. This was not one with a single dramatic charge. It was one with timing, coordination, across 3 armies and a navy that had never fought together before, and a series of decisions so precisely sequenced that Cornwallis would later admit he never had a real chance to break out, even though for most of the siege he still believed he did. Washington, watching from his headquarters in New York, had spent most of 1781 planning an entirely different operation. His original target was New York City itself, still the largest British garrison in North America, heavily fortified and defended by thousands of redcoats under Clinton. Rochambeau, commanding the French land forces that had arrived to support the American cause, disagreed. He believed Virginia, not New York, was the place to strike, and he had one argument Washington could not ignore. De Grasse's fleet was sailing for the Chesapeake, not for New York Harbor, and there was no changing that. Washington adapted, and understanding why that mattered requires understanding what kind of commander Washington actually was by 1781. He was not, by most measures, a brilliant tactician in the way Cornwallis was. Washington had lost more battles than he had won across 6 years of war, and his instincts, left unchecked, tended toward the bold and the risky, toward wanting to strike New York directly and end the war with one decisive blow against the enemy's largest garrison. What made Washington effective was not tactical genius on the battlefield. It was an almost unnatural capacity for patience and self-correction, a willingness to abandon a plan he had championed for months the moment better information arrived, even when abandoning it meant admitting, at least to himself, that he had been wrong. That is a rarer trait among commanders than raw aggression, and it is arguably the trait that won this war. It is one of the most underrated decisions of his career. He abandoned a plan he had nursed for months, moved his entire army 500 miles south in a matter of weeks, and did it while keeping Clinton convinced, almost until the last possible moment, that New York was still the real target. Feints, false correspondence deliberately allowed to fall into British hands, decoy encampments visible from British scouting positions. Clinton did not move to reinforce Cornwallis until it was already too late. Think about what this plan actually required to work. 3 separate forces. An American army marching from the Hudson Valley, a French army marching alongside it, and a French fleet sailing up from the Caribbean. All needed to arrive at the same stretch of Virginia coastline within days of each other, with no radio, no telegraph, nothing faster than a ship or a horse to coordinate timing across an ocean. A delay of even 2 or 3 weeks on de Grasse's part, and the fleet might have arrived after a British relief squadron had already reinforced Cornwallis, or after Cornwallis had abandoned Yorktown for a stronger position. A delay on Washington's part, and de Grasse might have been forced to withdraw south before the land forces arrived to complete the encirclement, since the admiral had already warned Rochambeau he could only commit his fleet to the Chesapeake until the end of October, before naval obligations pulled him back to the Caribbean. Every piece of this plan depended on timing that no single commander controlled entirely on his own, which is part of why, for most of the war, Allied commanders had never attempted anything this ambitious. What made 1781 different was that all 3 pieces, for the first time, actually lined up. By mid-September, the pieces were in position. De Grasse's fleet reached the Chesapeake first and fought off a British relief squadron under Admiral Thomas Graves in the Battle of the Capes on September 5th. It was not a spectacular battle by naval standards, no ships sunk in dramatic fashion, but it did not need to be spectacular. It only needed to hold the bay, and it did. Graves withdrew to New York to repair his ships, and with that single tactical retreat, the sea route out of Yorktown closed. Cornwallis's lifeline, the one certainty he had built his entire strategy around, was gone, and he would not fully grasp what that meant for another 6 weeks. On the ground, the coalition closing around Yorktown was staggering in scale for anyone who has only heard this war described as a ragged colonial uprising. Washington's Continental Army, roughly 9,000 men, regulars hardened by 6 years of campaigning, marched south alongside Rochambeau's French regulars. Another 7,000 professional soldiers in crisp white uniforms who had crossed an ocean for a cause that was not, strictly speaking, their own. The Marquis de Lafayette, barely 24 years old, had already spent the summer shadowing Cornwallis through Virginia with a smaller force, refusing every opportunity Cornwallis gave him to be drawn into a battle he could not win, and slowly, patiently, keeping the British Army penned against the coast until the larger Allied force could arrive. By the end of September, somewhere around 17,000 American and French troops had converged on a British garrison of roughly 7,000 to 8,000 men. The numbers alone tell you how this was going to end. What they don't tell you is how methodically it happened. Siege warfare in the 18th century followed rules almost as rigid as a duel, and both sides knew them. You did not simply charge fortified positions and hope for the best, not against an enemy dug in with artillery. You dug your own trenches, called parallels, closer and closer to the enemy line, protecting your own men from cannon fire while you brought your guns nearer and nearer to the target. On the night of October 6th, Allied engineers began digging the first parallel, roughly 800 yards from the British works, under cover of darkness, working in near silence so British sentries would not hear the shovels. By October 9th, the first guns were in place, and the bombardment began in earnest. American and French artillery pounded the British defences around the clock, methodically reducing Yorktown's earthworks, destroying supply stores and grinding down the will of a garrison that had nowhere left to run. Inside Yorktown, conditions were deteriorating in ways that no official report could fully capture. Food stores, adequate for a short siege, were running thin. Horses, no longer able to be fed, were driven into the river by the hundreds, simply to stop them from consuming rations meant for men. Smallpox and other disease moved through the cramped defences, striking soldiers and the enslaved people who had joined the British lines seeking the freedom Cornwallis had promised them in exchange for labour, many of whom now found themselves trapped in the same collapsing perimeter with no promise honoured and nowhere left to go. The bombardment did not stop for meals or for sleep. American and French gun crews worked in shifts around the clock, and by mid-October, Allied officers reported that scarcely a building inside Yorktown remained undamaged. Cornwallis himself reportedly took shelter for a time in a cave cut into the riverbank, one of the only places in the entire encampment offering real protection from the constant shelling. The subscribe button is right there if you want more of this channel breaking down the campaigns that actually decided history, because the next 5 days are where this siege stopped being a slow squeeze and became something closer to inevitable. By October 11th, Allied forces began digging a second parallel, this one only 400 yards from the British lines, close enough that two specific fortified positions, numbered Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, now stood directly in the way of finishing the trench. These were small earthen forts, each defended by a few dozen men, but they commanded the ground the Allies needed. On the night of October 14th, Washington ordered a coordinated night assault. French troops under the Baron de Viomeny would take Redoubt 9. American troops under Alexander Hamilton, then a young colonel eager to prove himself in a war he had joined as a teenager, would take Redoubt 10. Both assaults went in with unloaded muskets, bayonets only, to preserve the element of surprise, which meant that for the opening minutes of both attacks, Allied soldiers advanced through darkness toward entrenched positions, with no ability to return fire if they were spotted early, relying entirely on speed and silence to close the distance before the defenders could organize a volley. Hamilton, who had lobbied Washington personally for the honor of leading the American assault, rather than watching it from the rear, went in at the front of his column. French troops under Viomenil, striking Redoubt 9 at nearly the same moment, faced heavier resistance and took the position only after fierce hand-to-hand fighting inside the earthworks themselves. Both redoubts fell within 30 minutes, in brutal close-quarters fighting, at a cost of roughly 70 Allied casualties combined. It was a small battle by the standards of this war, and it was the moment Cornwallis's position became mathematically hopeless. With both redoubts in Allied hands, the second parallel could be completed, and Allied guns could now fire on Yorktown from point-blank range. Cornwallis understood what was coming. On the night of October 16th, he attempted the only move left to him, a desperate evacuation across the York River to Gloucester Point, where a smaller British detachment still held ground and might allow his army to slip north on foot before the Allied noose fully closed. Boats began ferrying troops across in the darkness. And then, in one of those moments that make history feel less like inevitability and more like fate with a sense of irony, a sudden violent storm swept across the river. Boats already loaded with soldiers were scattered, some driven miles downstream, unable to return. By dawn, only a fraction of his army had crossed, and there was no way to bring them back or send the rest across in daylight, under Allied guns. The escape attempt collapsed before it had properly begun, and the men who had already crossed to Gloucester had to be ferried back under fire once the storm passed, achieving nothing except further exhausting an army that had almost nothing left to give. It is hard to overstate how complete the reversal was. This was an army that, 4 years earlier, under different commanders, had chased Washington's forces across New Jersey with contemptuous ease. Now its most capable general was reduced to gambling his entire command on a night crossing of a river, defeated not by Allied guns, but by weather he could not control, in a war that had slowly stripped away every advantage his side once held. On the morning of October 17th, exactly 4 years to the day after Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga, a British drummer boy climbed onto the parapet of the defences and began beating a call for parley, the signal requesting a ceasefire to discuss terms. Allied guns fell silent. An officer waving a white handkerchief followed him out. Cornwallis had run out of options, out of ammunition, out of healthy men, and out of time. Negotiations took two more days. Cornwallis wanted terms similar to those granted to Burgoyne at Saratoga, allowing his men to be paroled and shipped home rather than held as prisoners of war. Washington refused, insisting on the same terms the British had imposed on an American garrison that surrendered at Charleston the year before, terms Washington had not forgotten and had no intention of softening now that the leverage belonged to him. On October 19, 1781, the Articles of Capitulation were signed at the Moore House outside Yorktown. Cornwallis surrendered his entire army. Close to 8,000 British and German soldiers laid down their arms that afternoon, along with more than 200 cannon and a fleet of transport ships trapped in the harbour. Cornwallis did not attend the ceremony himself, citing illness, though most historians since have read that absence as something closer to humiliation than fever. He sent his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, to surrender in his place. O'Hara offered Cornwallis's sword first to Rochambeau, who refused it and directed him to Washington. Washington, in turn, refused to accept a sword from a subordinate rather than the commander himself, and directed O'Hara to his own second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln, the same American general who had been forced to surrender Charleston to the British the year before. It was a small, deliberate piece of theatre, and everyone standing in that field understood exactly what it meant. What happened next mattered more than the surrender itself. News of Yorktown reached London in late November, and it landed like a physical blow. This was not a single lost battle in a distant colony. It was the second entire British field army lost to this rebellion in 4 years, following Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga in 1777. And it convinced Parliament, and eventually the King himself, that the war in America could not be won by force. Prime Minister Lord North, on hearing the news, is said to have paced his office repeating the words, "It is all over, it is all over." Within months, Parliament voted to end offensive operations in America. Within 2 years, formal negotiations produced the Treaty of Paris, recognizing the independence of the United States. A single besieged garrison on a Virginia peninsula, roughly 8,000 men, had effectively decided the outcome of an 8-year war. It is worth being precise about what Yorktown did and did not accomplish, because the myth tends to compress 6 more years of history into a single afternoon. The British still held New York City, Charleston, and Savannah when Cornwallis surrendered. Clinton's main army in New York remained larger than the entire force that had just taken Yorktown, and more than 25,000 British troops were still stationed across North America. On paper, Britain retained the material capacity to continue the war. What Yorktown destroyed was not British military capacity. It destroyed British political will. A nation that had already spent enormous sums of money and lost 2 entire field armies in 4 years no longer had the appetite in Parliament to spend more of either. That distinction between losing the capacity to fight and losing the willingness to keep paying for it is often the actual mechanism by which long wars end, and Yorktown is one of the cleanest examples of it in the entire 18th century. The strange thing about Yorktown, the thing that gets lost when we tell this story as a triumph of American resolve, is how much of it depended on choices that had nothing to do with America at all. A French admiral choosing to sail north instead of staying in the Caribbean. A French army willing to cross an ocean and fight under someone else's flag for a cause that was, at its core, about someone else's independence. A young Frenchman not yet 25 years old, spending a summer being patient rather than reckless, and refusing to hand Cornwallis the decisive battle he wanted. Washington deserves every bit of credit history has given him for adapting his plans, for marching his army 500 miles in weeks, for the discipline to let the French Navy's timeline dictate his own strategy instead of clinging to his original target. But Yorktown was not won by one army. It was won by 3 forces, moving with a coordination that should have been impossible for 18th century communication, converging on one point at exactly the right moment, closing a door that Cornwallis had unknowingly walked through months earlier. There is an echo of this same pattern 4 years earlier and a few hundred miles north at Saratoga, and it is worth pausing on for a moment because it shows this was not luck striking twice. In 1777, another British army under General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada with roughly 7,000 to 8,000 men, confident, well supplied, expecting reinforcement from New York that never came. American forces under Horatio Gates, boosted by militia that kept arriving faster than Burgoyne could account for, surrounded his army near the town of Saratoga. Burgoyne, like Cornwallis 4 years later, discovered too late that his supply lines and his escape routes had both quietly closed while he was still counting on reinforcements that were never coming. On October 17, 1777, he surrendered nearly 6,000 men, the first time an entire British field army had been forced to lay down its arms in this war. That surrender is what convinced France to enter the conflict in the first place, sending the very army and navy that would finish the job at Yorktown. Without Saratoga, there is no French fleet in the Chesapeake 4 years later. Without Saratoga, there is no Rochambeau, no de Grasse, no 17,000 Allied troops converging on Cornwallis. The 2 sieges are not simply similar in shape. One is the direct cause of the other, separated by exactly 4 years to the day, as if the war itself had been building toward a kind of grim symmetry neither side could have designed on purpose. 2 British field armies marched into position by commanders who each believed their line of supply and retreat was secure, both discovering in the final days that the ground beneath that assumption had already given way weeks earlier. What connects both stories is not luck. It is the same structural mistake, repeated by 2 different commanders, separated by 4 years and several hundred miles. Both Burgoyne and Cornwallis treated a supply line as a fixed asset rather than a contested one, something to be assumed rather than actively defended against a determined and increasingly coordinated enemy. Both discovered, too late to matter, that the war had changed around them while they were focused on the ground directly in front of their own lines. If you've made it this far, You already know this channel isn't interested in the version of history where wars get decided by a single dramatic charge. They get decided by admirals choosing which direction to sail, by young officers holding their nerve through a summer of small skirmishes, by a storm on a river at exactly the wrong moment for one side and exactly the right moment for the other. Subscribe if you want more of this, because there are dozens of moments like this one buried in wars people think they already understand. Stand on the ground at Yorktown today, and it is quiet. The earthworks are still there, grassed over, preserved, walked by a few hundred visitors on an average afternoon, rather than defended by 8,000 men under artillery fire. It does not look like the place where an empire's hold on a continent ended. But on an October morning in 1781, an American army, standing shoulder to shoulder with a French one, closed a door that a British general had built the walls for himself, and the war that had consumed both nations for 6 brutal years was, for all practical purposes, already over. Cornwallis went on to a long career afterward, eventually serving as Governor-General of India, and history remembers him not as an incompetent general, but as a very good one who ran out of room to maneuver against an enemy and a coalition that had learned to be patient exactly when it mattered most. Let me know in the comments which siege you want broken down next, whether it is Saratoga in full, the fall of Charleston, or something further afield entirely, and I will see you in the next one.